today about what I think is a relatively new way of looking at your experience, but maybe even more broadly than that, a new way of looking at reality itself. You all come to university, I suppose, to make your conceptions of reality more sophisticated. And you want to do that because you have to live in the world. And the more sophisticated your conceptions, the less likely you'll encounter tragic or harmful circumstances that you will be unable to deal with. It really matters if you know what you're thinking and you know how to think. Over the last 20 years, I would say, there's been a revolution in psychology. And the revolution has involved a transformation in the way that we look at the world. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. I entitled this talk, Reality and the Sacred. It's a strange title for a talk to modern people because we don't really understand what the sacred means unless we live within a worldview that's essentially, I wouldn't say archaic, but at least traditional. For modern, free-thinking, fundamentally liberal people, the idea of the sacred is anachronistic, or if not anachronistic, at least incomprehensible. So I want to start with a story from the Old Testament. There's a scene in the Old Testament when the ancient Hebrews are moving the Ark of the Covenant, and the Ark of the Covenant is a device that was manufactured in order to contain the Word of God. And there was a rule among the ancient Hebrews, which was you were not to touch the Ark of the Covenant, no matter what. And there's a story in the Old Testament where the bearers of the Ark of the Covenant, they used to carry it. The bearers of the Ark of the Covenant trip, and a man reaches out to steady it, and when he touches it, God strikes him dead. And modern people look at a story like that, and the first thing they think is, that seems a little bit harsh on the part of God, given that the man was attempting to do something that he believed was good. But what the story is designed to indicate, in my opinion, is that there are certain things that you touch at your peril, regardless of your intentions. And those things that you touch at your peril, regardless of your intentions, most cultures regard as sacred, as untouchable. I want to make a case for you today that those things exist, and also why they exist, and why it's necessary for you to know that they exist. I would also say that if you're properly educated in the university, especially with regards to the humanities, which are in some conceptual trouble at the moment, what essentially happens to you is that you're introduced in a relatively secular way to the concept of the sacred. You're here in the university to learn about the eternal values of humankind. And I think that people who tell you that those values do not exist or that they're endlessly debatable do you an unbelievable disservice. Now, I'm going to tell you first how you think about the world, I think. So, this would be a Newtonian view of the world. It's Newtonian and deterministic. And it's a worldview that dominated psychology and economics and anthropology and political science, you name it, for probably 400 years. But it's come to a crashing halt in the last 50 years. And the consequences of that have been manifested in a number of domains. The old world presuppositions are something like this. The world is made out of objects. When you look at the world, you see the objects. There they are in front of you. As a consequence of seeing the objects, you think about what to do. And after you think about what to do in presence of the objects, you act. Now that seems self-evident, because when you look at the world, there the objects are. And it appears to you that you see them, and then you think about them, and then you act. But there's a real problem with that. First problem is, use half your brain to see. Literally. Human visual cortex is a very large part of your brain. And the reason that the visual cortex is so large is that seeing is, as far as we can tell, actually impossible. Now, the fact that seeing, perception, is impossible wasn't discovered by psychologists, and it wasn't discovered by philosophers. It was discovered by people who were working on artificial intelligence and trying to make artificially intelligent machines. The presupposition of the people who were making intelligent machines was the hard part of interacting with the world is figuring out what to do once you see the objects. But it turned out that making machines that could see objects was impossible. And the reason for that is that boundaries between objects are not obvious. They're not obvious at all. In fact, it's very difficult to understand how it is that we separate things up at all. Now, let me give you an example. So, if you think about yourself, when you look in the mirror, you see yourself as an object. You see your eyes, you see your nose, you see your face, you see your body. And that's pretty much what you see when you look at other people. But that isn't all there is to you. In fact, that's hardly any of what there is to you. So you could say, for example, you exist at the level of the quantum particle. You can't perceive that. In fact, people didn't know that until 75 years ago. Above that level, you exist at an atomic level, and then a molecular level. And then you exist at the level of complex organs, and then the interactions between those organs. And then you, and then your family, and then the groups that your family belong to. And then the ecosystem that the groups of your, or that all your groups belong to. And so on and so forth, until what it is that you are can expand to encompass virtually anything. Now, when you look at yourself, you don't see that. You see yourself at a certain level of resolution. When you look at the world, you see yourself at a certain level of resolution. But all those other levels are equally real and equally relevant. And we, in fact, have very little idea how it is that you're only able to see what you see. Almost nothing has obvious boundaries. And this has real-world consequences. It's not something that's merely abstract. The technical term for this problem, the problem of how to bind your perceptions, to limit them, is called the frame problem. The frame problem was discovered about 40 years ago, and the philosopher Daniel Dennett called it the most important philosophical discovery of the last 50 years. The frame problem emerges to cause all sorts of trouble for people. So, for example, when Henry Ford invented the automobile, well, at least invented the modern procedure of building the automobile, what Ford presumed was that he was building an efficient means of transporting people from one place to the other. There were other unintended consequences of Ford's discovery. So, for example, Ford happened to be a great supporter of fascism. And the reason that he was a supporter of fascism was because he regarded the fascist political structure as a logical extension of the efficient methods that he'd used to assemble vehicles. So his mode of production was instantly manifested in a political philosophy. Furthermore, now, 2009, 100 years after the invention of the automobile, we've discovered some other things that the car was other than a place to move people from point A to point B. So, for example, it turns out that the automobile and the internal combustion engine are among the most effective technologies ever devised to transform the nature of the atmosphere and to heat up the world. Not only that, the car has completely transformed the nature of cities. And these were all unintended consequences of the fact that the car was far more than what people thought it was. And you can say that about any technological structure. No one knew what TV would do to the news, for example. No one knew what the internet would do to the music industry. Everything that you interact with is far more complicated than you see. The most ancient ideas we have about the nature of reality are predicated on a certain presupposition. And the presupposition is this. There's two fundamental modes of being that characterize reality. One is the absolute. And the absolute is the sum total of everything. So if you think about things in their most unbounded possible form, if you think of things in their infinite number of potential variations, you can think about that as one pole of reality. It appears classically that people have regarded their encounters with the absolute, which is all those multiple levels of being that are beyond your perceptual capacity, as equivalent to an encounter with God. Now, you know that in the Islamic religion, it's against the rules to make a graven image of any sort of Muhammad, right? The idea is that you're not supposed to make an image. And among the ancient Hebrews, the idea was very similar. The Taoists say that you shouldn't confuse the moon with a finger pointing to the moon. And what all that means is that the absolute is always something that transcends the finite frame that you place around your perceptions. So as soon as you start talking about it, representing it, making statues of it, or idolizing it, you lose your connection with the absolute because you've turned it into something that's understandable and concrete. Part of the wisdom traditions that the world still maintains make the constant moral presupposition that you should always be aware of what it is that transcends both your understanding and your perceptions. And you should keep firmly in mind that that exists. Now, when people talk about God in the modern world, they tend to think about something that's more, has more of the characteristics of a being. And I suppose that's where most of the debate about religious reality comes in. But the idea that there's an absolute that's outside of your perceptual capacity seems to be merely a statement of fact, especially given what we know now about the nature of perception, that the phenomena always transcends the manner in which you frame it. We've also come to understand that not only does reality have multiple levels of existence, but in order to perceive it, you have to stand inside multiple frames. This is a picture of a French city. It's a walled city. Now, the walls are there to keep the people in, and the walls are there to keep what isn't in the walls out. And so you can think about that as a protective structure. Now, I want to tell you how it is that you still inhabit a walled city and exactly what that means. So, for example, you think about this room, and I'm going to tell you how it is that this room allows you to see what it is that you see. Now, when you're interacting with a computer, you actually don't interact with the computer. You interact with the keyboard and the screen. If the computer crashes, then you interact with the computer. And you find that, as a general rule, very annoying, because you don't really understand the computer very well, and you don't actually see how complex it is until it stops working. Most of the time when you're interacting with the world, you're doing things with the world. You're interacting with it in a way that produces some consequence that you want. And that means in part that your perceptions are always framed by what you want. And that's actually one of the reasons why the world isn't just made out of objects. The world is made out of things you use and things that get in your way. Now, you're always applying a frame like that to the world in order to simplify it enough so that you can understand it. And you're aided in this process by all sorts of processes you really don't notice. Because when you look at the world, you think, well, there are the objects. But there's 1,000 things going on before you make that judgment. So, we'll look at this room. When you walk in here, the room tells you what to do. The reason it tells you what to do is because all the seats are pointed in the same direction. They're all slanted in a particular way. When you walk in here and there's other people sitting, you can see that all their faces point to the front. People's faces point towards what interests them. The room is set up to make you face the front. The theory behind the room is that the thing that's interesting in the room is happening at the front. It's a theater. What's happening at the front is a drama, right? Because theater is there to promote and undergird drama. A lecture is a dramatic act. The room tells you what to do. So you don't have to think about what to do when you come into a room like this. You can just do it because the room tells you what to do. And then you can think, you can sit in here in relative comfort and listen to this lecture. Why can you sit in here in relative comfort? Well, the people around you have been relatively carefully selected, right? As a consequence of analysis of their 12 years in school, the university has made a determination that they know how to sit down and listen. That hypothetically they're intelligent enough to understand the lecture, and that they're very unlikely to disrupt the proceedings with any unexpected outburst of emotion or motivation. Now, if anybody broke one of those rules, you can be sure that your eyes would move very rapidly away from me and directly towards the person who was causing the trouble, because that would take center stage. Now, this room is actually supported by 1 million invisible processes. So, for example, while you're sitting in here, you don't have to worry about whether it's raining, because there's a roof, and you don't have to worry about whether the roof is going to fall in, because you make the presumption that the people who built the roof are competent. And the electricity works because the utility is run by people who are competent, so it's almost always on. Buildings hardly ever burn down. The electricity hardly ever fluctuates. There's thousands of people out there working as hard as they can diligently to make this environment constant enough so that you can ignore all the thousands of things that you're ignoring, so that you can concentrate well enough to attend to the few things that you are attending to while you're in this room. You're in a walled city. There's multiple walls, and those walls protect you from what's outside the walls. You can think about it this way. This is a Taoist image of reality. Now, people think about this as a metaphysical symbol. But it's not a metaphysical symbol. It's an unbelievably practical symbol. The Taoists believe that the world the reality, is made up essentially of chaos and order. Chaos is all those things you don't understand. So I would say that chaos is all those things that exist outside of your perceptual preconditions. Order is all the things you do understand and all the places you go where the things that you do produce the results that you intend. And the Taoists would say, everywhere you go is like that. Everywhere you go has things that you understand that are orderly and has things that you don't understand that are chaotic. And the chaotic things attract your attention because you already understand the orderly things. If something unexpected happens, your nervous system automatically reacts to it and orients you towards it. And sometimes that can be catastrophic. So this is an experience that some of you will have in the next 4 years. Undoubtedly, there's a number of you that want to go to medical school, or to graduate school, or to law school, or to business school. And a certain percentage of you will take the admission tests that will determine whether or not you're able to take that path. And a certain percentage of you will score below the 50th percentile on those tests. And that will mean you will not be going to those institutions. And when that happens, first of all, you'll shake and tremble when you open the envelope to find out your results. And second, if you haven't achieved the score that you expected that you achieve, your world will fall apart. And what that'll mean is that you descend from the domain of order into the domain of chaos. And that happens to people all the time. It happens to people when they develop an illness that's serious that they can't control. Because then their body stops becoming something they can predict and starts to become something that they can't predict. It happens to people when they're in an intimate relationship and they're betrayed. They assume fidelity and the person tells them that they've had an affair. That's chaos. That means you didn't know who that person was. The future you imagine no longer exists. Your perceptions of people are erroneous at some level of analysis that you don't understand. It's conceivable that you're naive beyond belief and that everything you believed about yourself and other people up to that point is false. And when a revelation occurs that knocks out one of the walls that supports you and you descend accidentally into chaos, you'll regard that as one of the worst experiences of your life. When that happens to you, your brain knows exactly what to do. It stops thinking about the future. It stops saving up resources for the future. It puts you in emergency preparation mode so that you're ready to do anything at the drop of a hat because you don't know what to do. So your body prepares to do everything. It shifts your cortisol levels up. It activates your left and right cortices. Your limbic system and your motivational systems are disinhibited, turned on, and you sweat and you can't sleep because the orderly structure that you thought you inhabited, that provided you with security and direction, has now disappeared. The Taoists believe that the world is always an interplay between chaos and order, and that if you live your life properly, you stand with one foot in order and one foot in chaos. Because if you're only in order, nothing that's interesting ever happens to you. Nothing is anything but a repeat of all the things that you already know. That's the state that fascists desire. Because fascists desire things to be exactly the way they are forever. And if you're in a state that's only characterized by chaos, you're at sea or overwhelmed or things have fallen apart for you. And there's too much of everything for you to deal with. Now the Taoists, being very wise people, know other things as well. They know, for example, that chaos can turn into order. That's why there's a white dot in the middle of the black paisley. And they know that order can turn into chaos, which is why there's a black dot in the middle of the white paisley. And the Taoists believe that a meaningful life, the optimally meaningful life, is to be found on the border between chaos and order. And I would say that your nervous system tells you exactly when you are there, and it's a kind of place. And you can tell when you're there because you're secure enough to be confident, but not so secure that you're bored. And you're interested enough to be awake, but not so interested that you're terrified. And when you're in a state like that, when you find things interesting and meaningful, time slips by you and you're no longer self-conscious.